Okay, we're all set. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this last session on this Sunday afternoon of this symposium, international symposium, dedicated to the music of Fausto Romitelli. While we're also broadcasting this event via Zoom and YouTube, I want to also welcome our attendees. A warm welcome to you too. I'm glad that I'm able to present two very dear colleagues of mine who also teach at this institution, at the University of Music in Lübeck. So for the first talk, I'd like to welcome Ms. Ya-Chuan Wu. Ya-Chuan Wu studied flute in Taiwan and at the Hochschule für Musik in Rostock in North Germany. Then she pursued a degree in music theory at the University of Music in Lübeck. She's also lecturer for music theory and oral training in Lübeck and Hamburg. She frequently collaborates with several young composers and has a lot of experience with modern literature and modern writing for this beautiful instrument. As a flutist myself, I'm very much looking forward to hearing her presentation about Romitelli's early compositions for flute. Ya-Chuan, please feel free to start when you're ready.
Thank you, Louis, for the kind introduction. And thank you, Oliver and Sascha, for asking me to talk in this congress. Fausto Romitelli's early compositions are less known than his later works that are influenced by spectral music and popular culture and which have gained recognition in recent years. Some of his early works are performed occasionally, but there are even completely unknown pieces that do not even appear in his catalogue of works. Nevertheless, some elements that are typical for his musical language can be tracked back to very early compositions, although they point into a different direction of sound and aesthetic. In my talk, I will speak about two of Romitelli's earliest works, both for flute, Canto Mediterraneo for an ensemble for 7 flutes, and Dianicta for solo flute. I will present my analysis of both pieces with special regard to contemporary playing techniques that are linked very closely to the structure of the pieces and their combination and alienation. Romitelli wrote the two pieces in 1982, Canto Mediterraneo, and 1983, Dianicta. That was still during his study time at the Milan Conservatory. The latter is known a little due to some performances and a printed score. The published catalogues of Romitelli's works start with this piece. It was performed for the first time on December 18th, 1983 at Teatro La Commenda by Anna Maria Morini. It gained some recognition through a performance in a concert of the competition for international composers during the Steirischer Herbst Festival 1986 by Dieter Flory. On the contrary, the manuscript of the first piece was found by Oliver Cotta in the archive of Fondazione Giorgio Cini in Venice, where Romitelli's manuscripts are kept. There is no known performance until now, so most probably the performance in the concert this evening will be the word premiere. At first, let's have a look at Canto Mediterraneo. In this composition for 7 flutes, Romitelli only uses the reduced range of the upper 1.5 octaves of the flute's range, because almost all tones are played as flagellates. Only in the context of flageolet glissandos, the lower register is occasionally reached as the fundamental in the first octave is played. Thus, the timbre is a rather thin, corresponding to the piece, which is generally very quiet. If we look more closely at the sounds, a process of deformation can be seen. The tones are not static, their timbre is continually changing. The means of the deformation or change are microtones, oscillations, and glissandos. And for more intense movement, trios, tremolos, and flat tongue. These playing techniques appear in a very systematic order throughout the piece, so that they have a specific function in its structure. Because of this close relationship, I will explain both aspects, form and techniques together. Instead of using measures and time signature, Romitelli subdivides the form of the piece into several phrases that are marked by fermatas of 2 different durations. The longer one means the maximum length of a breath in which the so-assigned gesture should fit. The shorter one's duration should approximately behave as long. Furthermore, there are 3 types of rests: media, middle, lunga, long, and breve, short. The piece begins with 2 interlocked 4th chords, as shown here in my reduction of the score. The 5th, 6th, and 7th flute players play A5, D6, G6, and the 1st to 4th players play G5, C6, F6, B flat 6. This is a high register flageolet chord. Let us listen to it. The choice of pitches and the playing technique make the timbre appear empty and wind-like. The pitches barely change for a long time, 5 pages in the score. Only the timbre changes in an increasing amount. Vibratos and dynamics, then additionally microtonal glissandos, then bisbliandos, finally flageolet glissandos, quick chromatic gestures, and tremolos. After this long and subtle increase in timbre change, the chord finally changes, at least partly. 1st to 4th flutes change to A5, B flat 5, G6, and A flat 6, whereas 5th to 7th flutes keep the former tones. This results in a more dissonant chord than these 3 flutes also move to new pitches. Starting from page 11, the intensity of changes increases. The range of glissandos extends and the gestures of quick notes are getting more complex. The music rises gradually until reaching the climax of the piece on page 16. All 7 flutes play microtonal scales in upwards or downwards motion. In the following, a slow process of disintegration can be observed. The intensity of the entrance is decreasing. In the last phrase, there are only 7 separately played tones. They are with little exception forming a series of falling fourths. The form of the piece is supported by the dynamics. This table shows the development of dynamics over the whole piece, divides according to the phrases. As already said, Romitelli did neither use bars nor time signatures. Phrases are the only aid to orientation. In the beginning, there is 7/4 P, and this dynamic lasts for 8 pages or 10 phrases. From page 9, respectively phrase 11, and intensification starts that lead to page 16. At this point, the climax of the piece with a length of 2 phrases, the highest density of action and intensity is reached, as well as the loudest dynamic, which is piano. After that, the piece gradually comes down to 8/4 P at the end, resulting in an H form. In the middle section, around the climax, the intensity is kept high by means of avoiding caesuras. Romitelli uses arrows to indicate that phrases are continued across several pages of the score. How long these phrases should be is not defined, because the fermata size are left out here, as well as other possible information on the duration. The organization of the playing techniques is linked to the formal structure as well. In this table, I listed all playing techniques according to the order of their appearance from left to right. A constant of the piece are flageolet sounds, which can be found in every phrase. In the beginning, vibrato, oscillation, and crescendo diminuendo swells are added. Later, different types of glissandos join, starting from the 3rd phrase with a range of quarter tones, starting from the 6th phrase, flageolet glissandos. In the middle of the piece, more sonorous effects can be found. Gestures of several quick notes, tremolos, trios, and flutter tongue. After the climax, the number of techniques used per phrase is reduced gradually too. In the end, only flageolets and quarter-tone glissandos remain. Regarding the texture, a similar development can be detected. In the beginning, the piece is monophonic. Chords only sound with subdued changes. Starting from page 4, the texture gradually becomes more polyphonic. Because single gestures come out a bit more prominently. Single voices free themselves from the chords. The timing of the action is getting more independent until the climax, where all voices reunite again. Changes in texture are also achieved by combining the flutes into several smaller groups. For example, on page 7, there is a group consisting of flutes 1 to 4, which played flageolets with flutter tongue, blue boxes. The 7th flute joined them for a short moment. 5th and 6th flute played microtonal glissandos, red boxes. Flageolet glissandos can be found in 6th and 7th flute, but at a different time. At other spots, several flutes play principally similar gestures, but to a different extent. Green. An example are the flageolet glissandos of page 14 that are played in a short version by 2nd, 3rd, and 5th flute, and longer by 6th and 7th flute, just with little change in pitches. In the middle of the piece, there are gestures that are repeated for a certain amount of time. These objects are exchanged between voices in a way that creates symmetries. This is one of Romitelli's favorite techniques that he uses in many other pieces. Here is another very obvious example from Simmetria Doggetti. In this case, the exchange happens between the two staves of a single instrument because Romitelli writes the fingering in the upper stave of the soprano recorder, the resulting pitches in the lower stave. First, different fingering result in the same sounding tone, then different tones are to be produced with a single fingering. Daniel Müller has given another example from La Sabbia del Tempo yesterday. Back to Canto Mediterraneo, where the ending of the piece is organized in a polyphonic style in which can be found a precisely structured order of entries. In the score, it almost looks like a simultaneous entry, but in fact, their order is very important. The numbers above show the order in which the flutes enter, starting with the first flute, followed by seventh, the sixth, and so on. In a footnote, Romitelli gives this particular emphasis. This table shows the pattern of permutations of this sequence. The positions of the entries are listed in the columns, the first on the left, the last on the right. Related to these positions are the numbers of the instruments. The first phrase begins with flute 1 and ends with flute 2 and 3. The second phrase starts with flute 2 and 1 and finishes with flutes 3, 4, and 5, etc. The remaining entries are distributed to the other flutes in decreasing order. Now, I would like to present some of the most subtle changes of sounds. On page 4, for example, the flageolet played by second, third, and sixth flute result from two different fundamentals that are alternating in a trio, not from one single fundamental. Because of that, the flageolets become more shimmering. This playing technique can be found as well in Salvatore Sciarrino's piece, All'auge in una lontananza for a flute solo, written in 1977. Romitelli explicitly quotes Sciarrino in his instruction. Il prolungamento sensibile dell'istante in cui nasce il suono. The translation is notes in brackets, barely hearable hiss, quasi the gentle prolongation of the moment in which the sound is born. In Sciarrino's score, there is a very similar instruction, just a bit more details. This is a strong indication that Romitelli knew Sciarrino's piece and was influenced by it. The associative connection to the sea is an extra musical link that connects Canto Mediterraneo to several later pieces. We have heard this aspect many times yesterday. In Canto Mediterraneo, the Mediterranean Sea is celebrated, which is the Italian Sea. In later works, Romitelli chose titles such as Seascape, a piece for amplified pezzold recorder, or Mediterraneo, two pieces for ensemble. He also references the sea with lyrics or hints to texts, as in Ariel Song and Kogali, that deal with the song of Ariel from Shakespeare's The Storm. Whereas the piece that I just presented is completely unknown, the following composition, Dia Nicta, is the first of those works on which Romitelli's success is based. It is the first piece in the catalogue of works written by himself. A major stylistic development can be recognized. The core of this piece for flute solo is an ancient Greek text fragment by Ibikos. Phlegeton, aipe dia nicta mancranseria pamphanon onta. David Aitken Campbell translates it as blazing as through long night the brilliant sparklers. The text is articulated while playing the flute. The articulation of the text has not just a structural meaning, and the sound effect is not just limited to the sounds of the words. Recitation and flute playing are connected very closely. The instruction says to that. The performer recites a Greek fragment by Ibiko. He or she must play or talk at the same time. Greek phonemes are exploited to get special effects produced by adding vocal sound to instrumental sound. The performer should try to get a blending and flowing effect between voice and instrument, pointing out all different monophonic and multiphonic possibilities. For the notation, Romitelli uses two staves, one for the action of the flute, that means its notes and playing techniques, and one for the voice, that contains action related to language. Thus, the interaction of both can be written in parallel. Romitelli uses the consonants of the language for the articulation of the flute. The vowels are spread in between the flute tones and noises. The relation between articulation of language and flute playing changes across the piece in regard to the part of the text that served as basis and the character of the flute gestures and playing techniques. I would like to demonstrate this now. Legato, here with closed embouchure. Also legato, but different stream of air, here with closed embouchure. Staccato with high amount of air, without voice. Now with voice. Now with closed embouchure. Flutter tongue without voice. With voice. The staccato secco. Nu, voiced quasi-rim modulation of the played flute tones. Romitelli avoids giving the piece a time signature and a clef. but it is clear that a treble clef for the flute is intended. If, for example, this gesture is read in bass clef, senseless intervals like the diminished second B sharp, C occur. A treble clef is also assumed for the voice, because on page 3, voice and flute meet on the same notes. This becomes more obvious in the unpublished version for alto and bass flute that is identical with Dianicta but is titled Recitation of a Night Fragment. Here, Romitelli adds an extra stave with the notes G and G sharp in the case that an alto flute is used for performance. Besides that, he merely changed the title and the instrument marking, covered the date, and added an English instruction. The score is entirely identical. The score is clearly structured. Every line contains about 15 beats and often also represents a phrase. As a result, score and phrases are optically and musically organized in a very clear manner without the use of a division in measures. Furthermore, the phrases can be distinguished by the part of the text that is used herein. Romitelli fragments the fragment again and dedicates one or two phrases to each of the following fragments. Fl, 29 beats, legato, 15 beats, legato, IP, 15 beats, fl, te, lege, 15 beats, ton, IP, 14 beats, ton, IP, dia, nukta, 21.5 beats, interlude, 15 seconds, dia, nukta plus one time makra, 28 beats. Makran seria panfano onta, 10 beats, but tempo più lento, so it might very well equal 15 beats in the previous tempo. The connection of the text to playing technique is organized across the piece as follows. Fl, airstream is changed slightly with the use of the tongue, f or l position. This influences the timbre of the air sounds and occasionally appearing flagellates. Some key clicks are spread in. Legaton. T indicates tongue articulation with a lot of air, either unvoiced or voiced. Egeton is spoken in between the flute gestures with voice. Legaton ipair. Alternation between consonants and vowels becomes more intense. Fl, t, lege. This line is a recourse to the beginning, similar to the second half of the first phrase with air sounds and flagellates. Ton ipair. An even more intense alternation between consonants and vowels can be observed. Rapid flute gestures in upwards direction, played frullato, are prominent. Ton ipair dia nicta. Flagellate bisbriando on E flat, C sharp, and G is combined with flatter tongue. The density is increasing even more with all playing techniques used in rapid sequence. I'll play it now. I pair dia. I care. Diani. Diani. I care. Ani. Diani. Dia. Dia. Nik. Ta. Interlude. The performance has some freedom in interpretation. A sequence of notes is notated in a box, which is to be played ad libitum repeated with freely alternating legato and staccato articulation for 15 to 20 seconds. Fragments of the text, single syllables or a combination of syllables from two different words should be freely spread in between the notes. Dianicta plus 1 time makra. Ordinary playing technique and singing at the same time resulting in a kind of remodulation of the flute sound. This is the most sonorous moment. Makran seria pamfano onta. Here the spoken text predominates. Only k and s are colored by flute sound. The interval structure of the quick gestures. In dianicta, gestures of rapid sequence of notes are fundamental. They differ in length and are distinguished clearly from each other, even if they directly follow one another. At the beginning of the piece, they are grouped by shared starting notes too. The first three gestures start from D4, the next two begins at C4, then the first note circles around D4. The gestures have an upward direction at first, then they get a circled shape. They are composed of whole and half tones through tonal scale fragments are avoided. In line 4, the first direct repetition of notes can be found. And starting from line 5, the gestures are designed more freely concerning starting notes and shape. This table shows the starting notes, interval structures, and the number of notes of the gestures from the beginning of the piece. It seems that Romitelli aims at diversity. There seems to be no common patterns. But at some points, similar interval structures can be found. The numbers represent the intervals between two notes. So 5 numbers stand for a 6-note gesture. The pattern shown here appears several times, either identical in inversion or retrograde inversion. In this section of the piece, the range is limited to the first octave due to the playing technique, air and flageolet sounds. From line 6 onwards, the shape of the gestures is changing. Their intervals are expanding. Now, using ordinary embouchure, higher octaves can be reached. The quick gestures are interrupted by spoken vowels. Octave leaps can be found here, and overall gestures contain more and more leaps. iPad, 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 iPad. Later, in line 8, there's 1 9th, 10th, and 12th leap. Interlude ad libitum passage. The first 2/3 consist of strong gestures in a downward direction that have a range of more than 2 octaves. In the last third, there is a little tendency to upwards direction. In this section, unlike the rest of the piece, some scale fragments and repeated elements appear. Triplets and quintuplets can mostly be found at the end of a gesture. This adds a rhythmic intensification to the dynamic development. Crescendo or diminuendo present at nearly every gesture. At the end of the third line, there is such a quintuplet that ends the phrase with a diminuendo and a transition into a fermata 2. In the center of the fourth line, the upper side is happening. 2 triplets at extra speed for supporting the crescendo. In the preface of the printed score of Dianicta, the flutist Anna Maria Mogini, to whom the piece is dedicated, wrote, I met Fausto Romitelli in the early 80s, while he was still studying composition with Umberto Rotondi at the Conservatory in Milano. Though he was very young, he already showed the signs of a strong and unconventional personality. In a more specific way, besides a very strong bias towards instrumental instrumentation, I was impressed by his irresistible urge to explore roots resulting from the styles and aesthetics of structuralism. In Canto Mediterraneo, we can see how Romitelli, on the one hand, has been influenced by his predecessor, but on the other hand, has developed a musical language of his own. The structured organization of deformation and alienation of sound are characteristics of his style that can also be found in his later works. Dianicta is an experimental work for connecting and blending instrumental sounds and human voice and singing. Romitelli did not write another piece like this later, but his search for new effects has never stopped throughout life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ya-Chuan Wu, for this, I almost want to say, multimedial and interactive presentation. It's almost very interesting to know how performers like yesterday, Mr. Simone Beneventi, what do you say about your experience from this perspective? Thank you very much. I would say we still have a couple of minutes for a short Q&A session, so please feel free to start.
Thank you, Ya-Chuan. I have a question regarding the first piece, and more specifically the table with the extended techniques. Because in the piece that I'm looking at, or trying to analyze, the Nameless City, a similar table could be made with the extended techniques in the strings regarding a transition from tone to Geräusch. Oh boy, Oliver. So, yeah, also noise, thank you. Jesus, okay. I am the American though. Exactly. And I was just curious, and maybe forgive my ignorance if you mentioned this, but do you recognize a similar transition in the progression of extended techniques that Romitelli uses in this piece? Do you understand my question?
Do you mean in his later works?
No, specifically in this piece, because, yeah, so in The Nameless City, for example, he slowly introduces techniques which have more and more noise character, and I was wondering if this was the case in this piece as well. Yeah, maybe you mentioned, and I forgive.
I think this is quite similar. In the middle of the piece, there are more and more techniques could be used. And in the beginning of the piece, there's just flageolet, vibrato, alienation, and ziemlich quiet playing techniques.
Okay, thank you.
You also mentioned, you talk about early flute pieces from Romitelli. Maybe this is also a good cue if you don't still have this beautiful program, this beautiful booklet. We have a Werkverzeichnis, a work list compiled by Oliver Korte at the very end of this booklet. And you can see that Romitelli writes a lot of music for the flute, or the flute gets involved in these early works. How does it look at the late works?
In his later works, flutes play a role in most of his ensemble pieces. They are a part of the rich and full sound that Romitelli likes. He wrote just one further piece for a flute solo, a composition for Petzold recorder, written in 1994. In this piece, we can also find some of the techniques and sounds that Romitelli explored in his early flute music. For example, air sounds, in and exhaling, and percussive articulations, etc. Some aspects of his musical style can be also found in this piece. For example, the exploration of the sounds and the deformation and alienation of the sound as a structural element.
Thank you very much. That's also a piece which we're going to hear tonight in the concert. I think we're all very looking forward to it. Thank you very much, Ya-Chuan.
Thank you too.
Maybe we need a couple of minutes for the new setup, and we'll be resuming soon. So, And as a culmination of this very intense couple of days, I'm glad to introduce Professor Sascha Lino Lemke. Professor Lemke studied music theory, composition, and computer music in Hamburg and Paris. He's a professor of music theory and analysis, and is also responsible for the electronics studio at the University of Music in Lübeck. 2013, he became a member of the Freie Akademie der Künste Hamburg. His compositions have been heard in several festivals such as Musica Viva in München, the Darmstädter Ferienkurse, and the ERCAM, to name a few. Professor Lemke will hold a presentation about the mechanics of hallucination in Romitelli's quartets Domeniche, alla, periferia, dell'impero. So, Sascha, it's great to have you here.
Thank you, Luis, for the introduction, and all the professors. I was always waiting for a bad trip coming after the professor. In my very first Romitelli concert in Hamburg, I heard a small quartet composition called Domeniche alla periferia dell'impero, and I immediately fell in love with especially the first of these quartets. So today I want to share just a few of my ideas on the piece and investigate a few aspects of its mechanics of hallucination, which can certainly also be found in his bigger ensemble pieces, but which I find particularly touching also in Romitelli's skilled realization with this rather small and unassuming ensemble. So, in his essay, The Composer as Virus, Fausto Romitelli writes, "In contrast to our predecessors, composers of my generation have to deal with various problems, especially 1, the influence of technology, 2, the influence of media-based environment and new methods of communication, 3, the influence of popular music, pop, rock, techno, ethno, etc. Survival at the extreme periphery of the cultural imperium." In this statement, we already got to know this yesterday, we find the key to a better understanding to the rather baroque title, Sundays on the Periphery of the Imperium. A title given to 2 quartets which Romitelli wrote in 1995-6 and 2000. The first of which will be the object of our investigation here. In his essay, Romitelli goes on to criticize the way the cultural industry prevents composers like himself from being heard. That its mentality of leveling out only allows for the consumption of uniform standardized cultural goods. Instead of withdrawing into isolation, he suggests that one should take on the challenge of the big medial sponsored show and try the balancing act which separates the banal from the obscure, the excess of information from superfluity, the impossibility of communication from the simplicity ingesting of pre-digested messages. Although the first of the Domeniche pieces also displays Romitelli's typical taste for excess through obsessive repetitions and ecstatic hallucinations in the form of transformations and distortion processes, although it reaches dramatic summits and compressions as well as journeys which lead nowhere, it invites to a rather more private trance session than do the contemporary Professor Badtrip works. No electric guitars, keyboards, drum kits, none of the typical trashy side instruments and gadgets. These first come into their own on the second Sunday. There are no electronics apart from an optional resonant amplification. The instrumentation is classical, 2 woodwinds, violin, cello. However, instead of the more classical sound of ordinary flute and clarinet, he chooses the dark, smoky sonority of bass flute and bass clarinet, which can be made to sound wonderfully distorted in their highest and lowest ranges. The piece seems somehow secretive due to the pianissimi which grow out of the whisperings created by the instruments. Also, the hefty exuberant passages in which the bass flute reaches its puffy, windy limits only seem to reach their peak in order to be wafted away directly. Perhaps this session is really only conceived for insiders, for the initiated who have not fallen prey to the leveling down mechanisms of mass industry. For those that fight for survival in some unspectacular nether region, waiting for the time to come when they themselves will destroy the well-nourished body of mass industry, to put it in Romitelli's terms. Our ritual takes place on Sunday, the traditional day of the religious mass. This secular rite of Romitelli's, however, could be said to have been missed out on by the masses who were too busy sleeping off the effects of Saturday night. The score itself is so difficult to decipher visually that it paints a perfect picture of the inebriate state itself. It could maybe be compared with the mescaline pictures created by Henri Michaud, or by some of Professor Badtrip's drawings. One sees directly the uncontrollably speed and density in Romitelli's hypertrophic notational style. The page itself seems too tight for the 8 bars per stave into which he tries to squash, best he can, all his calligraphy. Perhaps even this is a good visual metaphor for the audible sensual vertigo which he aspires and which he also manages to achieve with his rather small ensemble. Last night, on the train with Oliver, we were discussing whether maybe Romitelli needed this sort of space notation, visual feedback to control the density of his work during the compositional process. A closer look, of course, reveals the precision with which Romitelli puts his meticulously calculated musical details onto the prefabricated manuscript paper. The calculations with which Romitelli sets his machinery of auditory hallucination in motion are the object of this talk. We are now going to investigate a few of the compositional strategies which make psychedelic sonic experiences possible. Let us start at the very beginning with Romitelli's choice of sound objects. Romitelli wrote that Professor Badtrip was blatantly inspired by Francis Bacon's 3 studies for a self-portrait. Bacon here choosing the human body as the point of departure most familiar to us, precisely because this point of departure is not an abstract but a most realistic theme. The distortion is able to appeal so directly to our senses. Romitelli also chooses the well-known as his point of departure. Already the first bar suggests a familiar sense of tonality due to the cello's overtoned glissando and the bass's flute's ghostly C with its Weissnoid particles. The basis of the first part is without a doubt C, in which one hears the overtone spectrum. The glissando ends a minor second too high on the D flat. In order to return to the central C after a tremolo glissando. At the same time, the bass clarinet plays the minor third E flat, shortly after completed to a C minor chord through the fifth G. We are, in fact, hearing a tonal music, a Phrygian music. The minor chord has the ability of awakening various associations depending on the hearer's background, be it Machaut, Dowland, Beethoven, Chopin, and of course Romitelli's beloved beginning of Shine on Me, but in the wrong tonality, so to say. Certainly this game with the well-known is one of the many reasons which make Romitelli's music so attractive. Romitelli presents the sound as if it came not only historically and stylistically from a distant place, but also acoustically. Dynamics are restricted to a maximum of pianissimo. It's a bit more than in Ya-Chuan's first piece, I agree. There's a strong percentage of white noise in the airiness of the bass flute. The finales, if we want to say so, of this Phrygian tenor clause, which does not find its close as expected in the resonant overtone-rich open C string, but closes an octave too high as a poor thin harmonic, as if an imaginary lo-fi loudspeaker were unable to reproduce this bass. And this harmonic bass C in the cello again breaks off at its peak to move on, to jump to higher harmonics in a different narrative of the piece, leaving the bass to the flautist. This sudden change of function of an instrument combined with objects here, the object bass note, jumping from instrument to instrument, is one of the strategies of creating a dazzling state of hallucination in instrumentation, which we will examine later. Hardly has the minor chord sounded for the space of an eighth note, but that the picture becomes hazy again, difficult to discern. Did I hallucinate? Did I really hear a tonal chord in this new music concert? Romitelli filters the fifth CG out of the minor chord and detunes it. The violin plays an eighth tone too high, the cello and bass clarinet play an eighth tone too low. Oh, that's too far. So this idea of distorting the perfect fifth CG belonging to the C minor chord now will build its own narrative, which lasts until bar 36. So this is the root for everything that comes. In the synopsis here, we see how the notes of the original fifth split and create two divergent lines. The steps first taken are eighth tones, only slowly overcoming the pull of gravity of the tonal object. Bit by bit, however, the size of the steps become bigger and bigger. Strikingly, the lower voices take larger strides than the higher ones. Romitelli misleadingly uses the term shifting in this sketch here that we saw for this effect. What he's actually imitating here is the effect of
ring modulation. This electronic effect which can do these strange things with my voice.
But can be used to create almost exactly the chords from Romitelli's score.
So the typical thing for ring modulation is that if we put the pitches played in a frequency range, we have an axis around which we have two sidebands that are always symmetrically apart from this middle axis. On this slide, I chose one of the chords and put in the exact numbers that would be the Hertz numbers between these middle G and the top note and the bottom note of the splitting of the G. And here we find the C and its sidebands here, and we see the Hertz numbers are very, very close. And the deviation is due to the fact that he uses an approximation of eighth tones or quarter tones in his score, which produced this difference. There are only a few mistakes when you calculate it, and there is one note where we are rather sure that it has to be slightly higher, as we can also see here in this graph. It's probably meant to be an arrow pointing upwards, then this would also create a better result. So there are really tiny deviations in hertz if we calculate all the chords. There are two places that stick out, and one of them is this pitch here, and another one is here, where Romitelli decided to get rid of the eighth tones and stick to a simple quarter tone resolution. So I think this is on purpose, but probably this is a tiny mistake. What is also interesting is that he chooses parameters that allow him to go away from the perfect fifth, but also to come back to his gravity center of C with the very last chord. So when we listen to it, we have this psychedelic effect of moving away from something we know and getting to completely new territory of microtonal chords, and in the end coming back sort of in the same room, a bit like this person in the Lost City wandering through a house and suddenly finding himself in the same chamber again. This sort of going away from the center and coming back to it again is also seen in the durations, which get bigger when we get further away from the center of C, and also smaller when we come back to it. This here is a simulation of this layer with sine waves. It's basically like taking chords out of the glissando that I just demonstrated before. Romitelli typically packs these transformations into obsessive loops, which are seldom repeated identically. Francis Bacon's 3 portraits also show 3 differently distorted images of the same subject, and one is reminded of William S. Burroughs, who, intoxicated, once spent 8 hours observing the toes of his shoes. We assume that he also did not spend the whole time perceiving the same thing, even though it probably was. Romitelli continues developing the loop element, as we have seen, examining the chords and durations of the distorted C minor chord, here shown as the green boxes. The loops also change because they are successively enhanced by new elements, which themselves then repeat and transform. So following one specific narrative of these interwoven threads needs a very attentive listener filtering an overwhelming flux of audio information. Let's have a look at a few of the new objects added to the loop. The next note added to the loop is the D flat, which is already present from the second loop onwards and serves as the penultimate of our loops for the typical Romitelli or even prog rock bass pendulum. Here it is D flat C. The bass note is always triggered by bass flute's exquisite tongue ram. This is also a sort of hallucinatory warping of the instrument I also just experienced when Ya-Chuan played with closed tube, because it's a warping of the instrument, which can be achieved by the trick of the closed pipe, which enables the instrument to make a sound normally only achieved by a pipe of the double length of the instrument we see. It also makes the flute sound more like a cello pizzicato. The sound is then taken over by the cello, which fades in arco as if it were the resonance of the flute's impulse. We find the same idea in an extended way in Professor Bad's trip, and must be agreed with some awfully good post-production effects from the Ictus CD. It sounds like this. And we can see that the jump of the bass in the score from instrument to instrument is even more dazzling than in the quartet, of course, because the instrumentation is bigger. There are more possibilities to do this sort of stuff. In Domeniche 1, the next typical element is this anticipation of the cello tremolo glissando, which is anticipated by the flute with a very noisy sound quality. And the last thing that is really typical for this element is that Romitelli adds a minor tenth to the bass, creating this really sweet color of a third or a tenth, if you want, between the bass and the top note. It sounds like this. This loop element is rather stable. It doesn't change so very much. It meanders a bit between 2 and 4 eighth notes in duration, but it is rather the stable bit. The more exciting bit that changes a lot and develops a lot is the antepenultimate loop element, the E flat, which we can see here in the highlighted moments in orange. It completes the Phrygian bass movement, so E flat, D flat, C, and the E flat element will become an important player. Let's listen to the beginning of the piece until we have heard the first 2 entrances of this new element in our loop. Yes, the bass line. This E flat bass is always accompanied by the F sharp as a very easy to perceive note, and this seems a bit not easy to relate to our Phrygian mode that has been established, but it is rather logical if we compare it to the bass note, which again gives us the sweetness of a tenth. So basically what we have here in our loop is a complete decimarium, which always gives us the sweetness of the third. Romitelli loves this. Also, he does it in other pieces, and it gives us a sort of strange, indecent sweetness to the new music context. But at the same time, Romitelli states, in the kingdom of mescaline, education and good taste are absent. In the preface, Romitelli writes that the piece should be performed in a very reverberant hall. Probably this could be said for many pieces of Romitelli's. He also uses the ensemble like an electronic reverb machine. in order to let the top note F sharp wander through imaginary spaces. The decrescendo here suggests the distancing of the sound object, as does the sighing descent of the glissando, which imitates something like a Doppler effect. So this effect creates both the impression of space, but also of movement in space. The delayed imitations in the other instruments simulate the reflections in space. The various timbres of the instruments simulate the filtering of the sound through the absorption and refraction of different surfaces. This can already be heard in the very first appearance of this element, where we can once maybe focus on a very high F sharp, which comes out of these harmonic gestures of the violin. So you will hear like a high echo of this flute impact in the violin. And also immediately after the flute has finished in the cello, this harmonic will reproduce the F sharp at the same pitch, exactly same octave, which is also be heard in the recording very easily if you concentrate on it. So already here we have this idea of echoing space, but this will become much more extravagant later, as we can quickly see here. But I want to show this in two other overviews, and then we will listen to it. This is a sonogram view where these two lines show us where the F sharp zone is, and the red and yellow elements show that there's a lot of activity in this zone, like also like a filter put on a recording, and sometimes sound comes out. What I want to make you listen to now is a sort of graphic score. Marcia will be laughing about me. A graphic score where I try to transcribe quite a few bars of this section. And you can see here in yellow the F sharp as the starting point. And then in different colors, the different instruments starting from this central pitch and building up more and more gestures coming from there. There are the sighs from the bass clarinet, from the bass flute, which started all off. There is the bass clarinet, who develops from the F sharp and glissando to C, a connection between these rather remote pitches, F sharp and C. They turn into like a melody that is repeated over and over again. We can see that this F sharp region is more and more inhabited by more and more gestures that fall down further glissando lines here, and also that become very difficult to discern in this complex polyphonic writing of Romitelli's. The blue lines shown here, they form for me something that I called klezmer melody for myself, because of the high register of the bass clarinet, because of the augmented major second here, because of the microtones and glissandi in there. This will become a very important melody of this piece. What I want to show is now this little demonstration, and you can follow all sorts of things. For example, the development of the bass clarinet melody, the development of the F sharp area, and also the distorted ring modulated fifth, which at the end of my recording will turn back to this central point C minor. By the way, 5 minutes? By the way, the empty spaces, they do not mean that the instruments are silent, rather that they are currently working on a different narrative level. One single instrument, especially the cello, is hardly to be followed audibly, because it keeps apparating and disapparating between the different narrative threads. Similarly, it is difficult to catch hold of where the sound object is at any given moment, because the sound object, seemingly erratically jumps from instrument to instrument. This makes both the individual voices as well as the clearly heard musical objects seem phantasmagorical. The sensory impression can scarcely be correlated with a reality. By amplifying the instrumentally simulated spaces electronically, by adding reverberation, which is optional for this piece and mandatory for others, Romitelli creates even another subordinate level on which this already instrumentally simulated space is given another virtual territory. It becomes a true labyrinth of hallucinatory spaces. Sorry. A last remark on form. This here tries to show the 17 different loops throughout the development of the first half only of Prima Domenica. And we can see that the accumulation of material and also the lengthening of especially this element gives us, on one hand, the impression of a loop, and at the same time, more and more the difficulty of following it. This idea that we get sort of lost in the accumulation of more and more material and more complex material is enhanced by another idea, which will come back very similarly in the second half of the piece as well. It is the insertion of another layer, which I put in black here, called it inserts. And you can see easily that they become more and more prominent and that they sort of destroy any feeling of a loop in the first half of the piece. The second half works a bit similar to that, just that the different elements have similar but not exactly the same harmonic content, different procedures but related procedures. But we can see that the building up of the loop, the cutting up of the loop is very similar to this. So that it is a bit like in Professor Bad Trip with the 3 pieces that, as Romitelli said, are like 3 rituals that resemble one another. Here we have like the ritual twice in one piece. Just as a short conclusion, I think what I also like about this piece is that it manages to give us many clues of what Romitelli really loves. We can still hear these minor chords which resemble the rock music. We can get the feel of the balancing the pendulum between the 2 basses. We have this idea of looping, and at the same time it is not the right media really for this. So when we listen to Professor Bad Trip, it is immediately clear that the, for example, the e-guitars show us what this piece is about, and that the ensemble is the instrumentation, an extra effect machine on top of the electric guitars. Here it is a bit like when in the 5th cello suite there is a cellist on stage and trying to tell us he wants to play a fugue in 4 parts. And the exciting thing is that he manages to do it. For me, in this piece, it is a bit similar that I get all the features of Romitelli's music, but with a medium that is even further apart from what the music suggests. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sascha, for this presentation. I already said multimedia. I'm afraid I don't have any more adjectives. Thank you very much. For those who are following this session on YouTube, we will be happy if you decide to write down your questions using the chat function. We also have our public and our guests on Zoom. Please.
Otherwise, I'm really happy to relax and have a bit of space before the discussion. So, yeah.
Maybe. Thank you very much, Sascha, for it's been speaking. Yeah, here. Thank you very much for this intervention. It's the analysis. My comment is more a comment or a general comment than a question, because what seems to me that there is still some work to do between the influence of electronic technology or some procedures on the instrumental writing in Romitelli, because in these 2 days I saw so many electronic devices or techniques applied to various works. So like shifting, like ring modulation, like chorus. In Lost there is a lot of harmonizer effect, and they all do affect the writing. I mean, in the French, the écriture. So the way how the harmonic field are developed from a certain section. So I think that it's one of the constant of these 2 days. I have other ones that probably will come in our general discussion, but from your presentation, this aspect is very important and also very, very clear. Obviously, also the question of loop, that it's something that I have to think about after this today, and differentiate, make a better differentiation, or maybe more precise differentiation of various ways of creating a loop. Yeah, so thank you really for your presentation.
Maybe if I may, yesterday on the introduction, Oliver spoke about Adorno and how Adorno maybe wouldn't be that amused about the materials from Romitelli. But you quote Romitelli in the very beginning, and I feel that's not that far away from Adorno, from the thinking. What are your thoughts about that?
I just sat with Oliver and we were thinking, well, what could we discuss soon? And we both said, well, it's very strange that on the one hand, he of course wants to escape the ivory tower and feels like changing the new music scene, bringing it to a broader public, and at the same time criticizing that it is not possible because this audience is not there. It is busy digesting cheesy stuff from the mass industry. And somehow this is an unresolved question. Well, where do you position yourself if you want to come out but nobody's there? It's sort of the old experience of the composer. And I don't have an answer to that, but I find it a very puzzling moment. Yeah.
So then I would say thank you very much, Sascha. Thank you very much, Ya-Chuan, our speakers of this session, our guests and our attendees. I hope you enjoyed this session. We will have in a couple of minutes our closing discussion, our final plenum. I will leave you in 5 minutes exactly. I will leave you in the good and very expert hands of Oliver Korte. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
So, the last part, every talk given, the last part of our conference. While lunchtime, we sat together, Sascha and me, and we had a nice little falafel on him, which is very important because I will have to pay the beer, I guess, we will have on the train this night. And we talked about some topics, some aspects, some motives that repeatedly came up while in the course of this conference. And we found 3 fields of questions or of topics that repeatedly came up. And I want to present these 3 topics to maybe talk about it, but this is by no means mandatory. I'm quite sure that every single one of you has very personal major aspects and major impressions, and we don't want to suppress any of them. But yeah, here we go. One of the questions that seemed to be quite important in many of the talks was whether Romitelli is a modern or a postmodern composer, or whether both labels don't quite fit and both labels somehow missed the point. At last, Romitelli's answer to this is quite clear. He sees himself in the modern tradition. This might also be to protect his career, who knows? But we have to see these many quotations and allusions in his music and heterogeneous material all over it. On the other hand, we have a quite obsessive character, composer who uses a very restricted set of material again and again at a limited number of processes and strategies, and again and again, and not only in one work, but again and again from work to work. So one could say that many works are in fact some kind of one work or emanations of one work in different contexts. Like in Vivaldi, I think it was Stravinsky who said that Vivaldi wrote just one concert, but this one's a concert 400 times. Is it the same with Romitelli? Is his music quite the opposite of heterogeneous genius? Is it one piece, developed on and on? For example, we have heard that the harmonies of his are not as heterogeneous as they seem. Spectra and major minor triads appear as coming from the same source and only to be extreme poles of the possibilities to interpret one and the same material. Okay, modern versus postmodern. Another question that came up repeatedly was the question, I want to put it quite naively, what does Professor Bertrip has to teach? Because it's a lesson, or it's 3 lessons, but what exactly does he have to teach? And I'm quite sure that especially Gaia, who's an expert in education, has to say something about this. And the question for me personally is, because I enjoy his music so much, what is so attractive to it? Is it really only dystopian? One very often reads that his music is somehow dystopian, or is there a certain utopia in it? What is the reality that it reflects? Does it reflect certain aspects of reality, or does it create alternative realities? And a very the last question in this context could be, is this work music as a drug or drug as music? This third complex we had, and you already mentioned it, was the question of the ivory tower versus mass media, because Romitelli sharply criticizes composers who choose to retreat in their private, private languages. On the other hand, he even more despises everything that has to do with mass media, which leads us to the question: where is his point in this play? Whether this, it didn't seem quite clear to us what he reaches at. Especially because, in a way, he depends on mass media, because this is one of his main themes. He works with it. He repeatedly comes back to it, and his criticism of mass media is part of the essence of his own work. Okay, these only as little inputs, but again, you're very, very welcome, also the guests on YouTube, to ask questions, to make their own point. And with this, let's start to talk about Romitelli. Gaia.
Yes, perhaps I can start with this educational question, but I would like to start from a very subjective point of view, but I hope I will end with my thought with the postmodern question. So I try to surround all your fields you opened up. For me, the educational goal still is a kind of enlightenment goal, to say the liberation of the human being to him or herself, as Blankertz put it in the 80s. But in my reading of this educational goal, the subject has to be educated as a weak subject, to consider its correlations and to engage with its experiences. And experiences in a way, not only knowledge or not only thinking, not only the thinking part, I would like to say, but a full experience of all senses becomes important in it. And in the end, the goal may be that the subject can subversively resist domination, and that would be the educational goal in a point. And in another way, Hönigswald said this very important sentence for my thinking: in experiencing, subject and object of the experience can be differentiated. And so what makes Romitelli so fascinating to me is that he focuses on the experiencing, on this fluent kind of experiencing, on the performance, if you like, if you want. And so it can show that and what music makes experienceable. And the other perspective of perhaps music theory or musicology is that it shows how music makes it experienceable, and I may say that and what, and it's myself in the experience of music, and that is what is shown. And as another colleague of mine, Hans-Christoph Koller, once put it in his transformational education. He says in contrast or with the example of books, he says, if you are a different person after having reading a book, then that has been Bildung. You are gebildet, Bildung, educated, if you are a different person after reading. And I think that is one thing that one can say very clearly. It also is right to music, and it also is very much right to Romitelli. You are a different person after having heard. As Sascha told us a few minutes ago, he said, after I heard his music for the first time, I've been fascinated and I started to think in a different way about music. And in one hand, you may say yes, but as every music is a performance, isn't that right to every kind of music? And in a way that may be, but I think the typical Romitelli hallucinating style, I would call it, the hallucinating style of Romitelli's music, very fits to post-structuralistic thinking. As you know, I wouldn't say postmodern, but post-structuralistic, because it's a kind of leaving old and founding new traditions. And I think it's very special that Romitelli himself takes the cyberpunk and the rock and the Pink Floyd pieces and makes and builds up something new as a kind of new tradition. So this is how I would put it.
Thank you.
Oliver, est-ce que je peux intervenir? Sauf si about the question you just said about the question of modern and postmodern, I have said, and so you know my position. But I think you said something that is really interesting. I think that Romitelli would agree with the question you said, if whether he elaborate just one piece and is just one work, one man that work for a life on the same work. I think it is he could agree with this idea. For example, he would forget the pieces he had made, move on to something else, continue to perfect the device. It is just one and the same, I don't know, but I think this idea of continue to perfect a work is something something true in the case of Romitelli. He had as for the drugs, I wanted to say something also. I don't know what was important for Romitelli was, I think, exploring the limits of perception. That this idea was very, very important. What happens aesthetically when you perceive in moments of excess? Think of the panic experience of Jimi Hendrix burning his guitar, and this image was an icon for Romitelli. What interested him was whether something artistically valid, interesting, could be created from the perspective of an altered perception. such a perspective, I think, of an altered perception introduced to a new form of sublime in music. A music conceived not only as music, but in wider context of a synesthetic experience of sounds, lights, colors. What would have interested him if he had lived longer? We can guess. I don't know if he would have continued to draw inspiration from something as drugs, mescaline, and so. I guess he would have found other ways of thinking about the sublime. The psychedelic and the mescaline are one of the chapter in this guest, not the ultimate goal. It's something a means to think to something. How create something sublime, a new kind of sublime in music, I think. That was really something very, very important for him. That's what I wanted to say. And that is linked also to something that Oliver said. I appreciate this idea of the rituality. You are right, I think. Often there is only a small step between ritual and obsession. In the same time, I think what is important in a ritual is the fact that it presents itself as a kind of collective norm, or a norm actually followed by some people. The ritual can certainly become an obsession, but it has, in a certain sense, a more objective shared character than the obsession, which can, for its part, be psychological, entirely psychological, individual. I think this dimension is very important in order to give Romitelli's repetition a character which is not subjective, but in some way objective. It is ritual in fact. What he wanted to say is that this obsession is what we are living, and not what is your obsession, mine obsession as a psychological phenomenon. I think it is something that is similar to the idea of a rituality, in fact, that is shared by some people, by a group of people, by everybody today. That's some ideas. So in relation to what you said, it was really a great job. Thank you very much. All the talk are so rich, so interesting that really it was really a very, very good job. Thank you.
I can only say thank you in the name of all. We all together contributed to something very, very dense and interesting. But may I answer to some of your points, just because I find them so interesting. The first point that you said, he would have agreed to the point that maybe it's just parts of one single big work. It came to my mind that we very often talked about the structure of his the form of his works, which is made of sections with sections which are quite similar, and we very much talked about sound objects on different levels of his work, formal objects and sound objects and sub-objects and so on. And in a way, one could say that every single work of his is also a sound object. an emanation of his general idea that might be fit to it. And the other point with his video opera, we haven't talked about his video opera at all in these 2 days, which is quite a surprise. But with his video opera, he opened completely new doors in his own oeuvre, with light, with video, with this dramatic aspect and so on, with film. And sometimes I think what would have happened if he would have written other works, more works, where would he be today? I'm quite sure that he would have followed that path on.
Yes, in fact, he has also the idea to create another video opera. He had this idea. I think this is probably true, yes. But you consecrated, you dedicated this meeting to Professor Batra in the title, and so I think that's a reason for not everybody speak about an index of metals. I don't know. But it's true. It's another chapter. The video opera. It's open other ways.
Yeah. There is a question or a remark.
More a remark. I would like to ask you if you would agree what we did seems to me something like the figure I have found for my way of thinking, because every aspect and everything which was mentioned fits into it. We are talking about the subject, the object, different kinds of object. Maybe I have a reminiscence in it to the index of metals, because I put a metal plate into this picture, because I think Romitelli there told us about that he was so interested in materials and to show different kinds of materials with his different compositional settings. And so he shows us different objects which can be experienced, as well as different kinds of subjective positions which we find for ourselves, or which can be seen in his work. And we are confronted with our own experience in experiencing his work. So I think what we did actually as a group on these 2 days was to focus different parts of this setting, but I think really we did it in a very synesthetic and multi-dimensional way. So I wanted to show you my kind of Tafelbild, what pedagogues always do.
Thank you very much. There's Fabian.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to ask something about this this term of the ivory tower, because my question is actually if that means only the composer itself, that who develops his ideas just by himself, or maybe that could mean also the whole kind of classical contemporary music scene as a whole ivory tower, a bit apart from the public and the mass media, of course. So actually, what are we talking about when we talk about this contradictory concept pair, mass media and ivory tower?
What would you prefer to talk about?
Yes, actually about both a bit, because because I think, and that leads a bit towards the question of modern and postmodern, maybe, that Romitelli is quite interested in this question, and he really wants to work about the question of the ivory tower and mass media, and so he needs both ideas a bit to be present in his work. And for me, that is quite a postmodern way of thinking. So yeah, but really, it was a question to you, because I think you said you discussed before about this fields you have you had there, and so yeah, this question came up. So my question was to you: what did you think about when you said ivory tower and mass media? Did you think about maybe the idea of the contemporary music scene also?
I can only talk for myself. I did, but luckily our whole society is some kind of assembly of different ivory towers. It's very pluralistic, and there's space for many colors and obsessions. And one of them can be contemporary music, but on the other hand, to present it in a broader sense would not be detrimental.
Maybe this might also be a question to the people who knew Romitelli very well. What sort of a public was he hoping for? Did he talk about changes of publics he would like to welcome to his concerts?
Alessandro?
He was interested, I think, especially in the way of the new way of composing, and not particularly in the question of the public. The idea was that the exercise of composition changed in nature, and the fact that today it's possible to imagine a composition that is done by some people that has no education, no classical education, was something that for him was relatively fascinated by this. The fact that everybody with a computer can compose music and can listen in a different way because have an experience with sounds that are created by a device. So he was particularly fascinated by this phenomenon. But I think he lived before the great revolution that we are living now, and so he was aware of certain phenomena, but not the web revolution. I think the web revolution. You can think something that we started with 2004-5 with the Web 2, with the social media, with this other kind of experience that we can have with the media. The media for him was TV, radio, and not the new media that we are living now. The media where the interaction is very, very important. The social media where everybody is how can you say, is an actor. These are, I think, for him, the media are also are the media of the radio, television, and the experience of media of the 19s. So that's what can I say. But I don't know if it is the answer to the question.
This is very, very interesting because the internet already existed in 2004, certainly.
Yes.
But this was not a reference for him, to nothing to refer to.
I remember I have, I think in an old computer that I have somewhere in my house, I have his first email, the first email he wrote, because well, he had, I remember, a computer. Now I think it is in Venice, in the Fondazione Cini, you know. That was an Apple. He used that for a certain period. He has another computer. I think it was his father that had this computer, but it was not so. He has not so practice with this with the email. I remember it was for him something new. Of course, it exists, but it was not so typical of the everyday life as for us now. Absolutely no.
Adorno, the Adorno quote of Jakob was much more near to Romitelli thinking as I personally thought. I thought that he is some kind of an early child of the internet. But no, he is a radio and TV guy.
I think, and if you think for Audiodrome, for example, the example he had in mind is TV. Trash TV, trans is TV. I think is the TV, the trash TV of the Berlusconi era. So.
If I may, I would like to add just a short observation. Okay. I think there is one reflection on it, on the musical culture in Italy at the end of 80s and in the beginning of 90s that has to be done. Because when, in my opinion, or as I have understood the concept of ivory tower, la torre d'avorio, which is really so Italian expression to address some academic positions in music culture. So if you think there is, let me share if this, it's in Italian, but I hope you can already understand it. There is in some of my lessons is just a second. Yeah, it should be there, but it's not. Okay, I will just explain. So in the 80s, Romitelli, together with Pietro Boradori, Domen, Riccardo Nova, Verrando, and Gervasoni, they founded Nuove Sincronie in 1990s. Nuove Sincronie was an association, musical association of composers that were strongly connected to the itinéraire. And also there is an axis I spoke about in Paris in 2016, an axis Milano-Paris, because in late 80s, there was a strong relationship with Dufour, Levinas and Griset, and also the first translation of Dufour writings was in Italian was 1987, so maybe 1 year after the publication of Hugues Dufour works. What I'm trying to say that Romitelli was part of a larger group of young composers who try to build their own musical and cultural context for the performances of their music that was a little bit different of what was the musical culture in Italy in 80s. And so this axis, Milano, Paris, was very important for them. So if you read the booklets of Nuove Sincronie festivals, so there is a lot of desire to present new works that are more based on, that are more sound oriented, and sound that means the processing of spectral technique in a new way. They started to work in late 80s and first 90s with cursus of composition and informatique musicale is something that is so decisive for their way of thinking sound. It's slightly different from the first spectral generation because they can now work on the sound as a composition assisted by computer without using electronics, but with the electronic procedures in mind. So I would like to just to point out this aspect. There is between Ivory Tower and mass media, there is a huge musical and culture and of compositional technique that is sound-based and that is rooted in spectral composition and spectral tradition, if I may, but mediated with these new technologies from 90s onwards, which is so different from the sound and from the technical point of view of writing. So, and there is the last aspect that Romitelli is also Verrando, Riccardo Nova, they all try to touch the public, just to be violent and just to say, wake up, hey, people, what are we doing? Which kind of culture are we living in? So this kind of violence was also because the sound was one of the ways that they had just to wake up us. Yeah, that would be the most important thing that I have to add. Thank you.
I completely agree with Ingrid in that point, that a new generation founded something new in that way. But on the other hand, I have a question, and I would like to ask Pascal, because he told us in his lecture that there is a tradition, in a way, we call it sometimes new music or new, and this is also a kind of tradition, if you like. And so I would ask Pascal if he would say Romitelli really invented something new, invented a really new tradition, perhaps, or if he would say, no, it is one point in a own tradition, but it is still traditional in a thinking of new music. That's my question.
Thank you for this question. So to answer this question, I need to be a little bit self-ironic. So, first point, my answer would clearly indicate my position between modernism and postmodernism, because, of course, in the lecture or in the presentation I have made, by trying to include Romitelli within a story of sound-oriented music in the 20th century, of course, this resembles very strongly a modernistic narrative. So he is certainly somebody who has been very aware of what composers before him had done, and indeed, and this was the reason why I tried to combine compositional aspects and the problem of the technologies. And so, in a certain way, this question, has Romitelli written one piece for all his life? Well, perhaps the project of composing since Varese has perhaps not changed. It is perhaps that with the possibilities of each generation, it becomes possible to enter the sound world in another way, and to react also in a different way to the sounds that are around you. And of course, if Romitelli, and this is the postmodern side of the thing, if he reacts to things that are outside of the Elfenbeinturm, of this ivory tower of contemporary music, it is precisely because there was something that was inquietant, struggling. And it was not, and here I wanted to add a little element to this former discussions, and it's a historical element. So Romitelli arrives in Paris at the very beginning of the 90s. Pierre Boulez was then 65 years old. Okay, he was at the point of leaving the IRCAM. And there had been, at the end of the 80s, very strong struggles in Paris to find the best person to succeed him in directing the IRCAM. This was one of the reasons why Hugues Dufour's book had been published in these years, because it was to position him as one of the possible successors for Boulez. But what is the point with Boulez? Is that Boulez, as a conductor, has always indeed reinforced a certain kind of institutionally now recognized music. What he did in the 50s to make this music audible in Paris, well, he didn't do it any longer 30 years later. In the 70s, when IRCAM was installed, and when Boulez still had the direction of the Domaine Musical, the itinéraire was a kind of contemporary counterculture. And it is precisely this attitude of counterculture that somebody like Romitelli has taken over. And of course, there was a very, very strong repertoire contemporary music presence in Paris in the 80s and first half of the 90s. And this made it really that in a certain way, in the worst sense of the word, there existed new festival music. You could go to festivals and you could hear the same music played with a few different things. The most funny thing is, of course, that everybody imitated what the old Boulez and the old Berio did. You have heard that for hours in music festivals. And of course, this is certainly one of the points of this ivory tower that Romitelli attacks. And I think that Alessandro was completely right. In the late 90s, even if we began to write our first emails, where did people who worked in studios for electronic music outside of IRCAM, because they had the big machine, but everybody else tried to work with Macintoshes and other computers. The information were taken in fanzines and magazines for private studios. And so there was a very close connection also with people who worked in popular music and who made really research in these domains. And so there was a kind of utopia, perhaps, of another kind of fusion. Berio and Pousseur had dreamed about that in the 60s, but a fusion of high and lower culture. And the idea was that technology could be the path to have these exchanges. I think that finally the question has been raised, what about the public Romitelli would have wanted? Okay, when we organized the concert in the 90s, we all thought that if we make one concert with a group of contemporary music and the other one with DJs, that finally our public would mix. No such thing has happened. This is completely delusion from the point of view of the organizer. So there are things that really need to be reported to the historical point of view. And I think that, to me, Romitelli has added something to the state of the musical material, to make my little Adorno, in the beginning of in the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000 years, because he has reopened the musical ears for something that had been relayed on other musics. But this is what happened also earlier. So in the 80s, when the DX7 of Yamaha came, all these contemporary composers were looking toward what the rock groups were doing with these instruments, because they were so restrained with their trained music bagage that they wanted to have inspirations of things that could help them also to go beyond. And this going beyond, I think, is really this looking more and more precisely into the sound. And for this, I was so happy with the presentation by Simone, because a few instruments he played show that very early he had an attraction for moving sounds, for combinations of sounds, and that precisely one element, and this would be my last general comment on the things I have heard, I would suggest that it's perhaps necessary for Romitelli to try to reflect if indeed we should not need to change a certain number of our tools to speak about music. To me, counterpoint is no category for Romitelli. When different things arrive simultaneously, they are strongly related to one object. And even if you have multiple instruments playing, it is part of one sonic event. And I think if you begin to reflect on this basis, this does not only change our hearing and our combination or hierarchization of what we hear, but it would also change and reorient perhaps and open new ears for musical interpretation also. So I have not completely answered probably to your question and integrated many other things, but this is what I had to say at that point. Thank you.
Very interesting, Pascal. If I can add just something to what Ingrid said also about this axis Milan-Paris, because I remember something. I think you are right, but it is very true for Romitelli and maybe for Giovanni Verrando. For the other, people of the Nuove Sincronie is not so clear, because I think less certainly for Boradori, for example, for Riccardo Nova. They are all Donatoni's pupils. At the beginning, Donatoni was really the master. I remember a concert, a little festival organized in Gorizia by Fausto Romitelli and me, in fact. But it was at this period in and all the Donatoni's pupil are there. And I remember after this experience, the route to Paris was particularly followed by Fausto, by Romitelli, not in the same measure by the other. They have also interested to be performed in Paris, and so of course for a reason it's clear it was a good scene, no? But Romitelli was the only that clearly wanted to change the way of composing and to adopt a new paradigm. When he composed La Sabbia del Tempo was really something new in this context. I remember very well the first presentation, the first performance in Trieste, or one of the first in Trieste with the other people of Nuova Sincronia. They were all very so surprised by this new style, and it was amazing. They are very, very interested. Fausto was much more radical in calling for something new and looking to Paris. I think it was really clear. I think the contact with Hugues Dufour was fundamental, was really his master for a certain period. And you are right, in this period there was this question with Boulez, and I remember this book by Dufour. I did a review of this book for an Italian review. I remember, because it was translated, Musica, Potere, Scrittura. No, c'était ça. Romitelli was really interested by this book. I think I have somewhere some copies of this book with some annotation, or he read very he paid really attention to this book, and Dufour was the example for him. And so for the idea also to go in the direction of the amplified sound on the Saturn was the idea to exploit, to explore for a moment. Then the strategies invented by Romitelli are completely different. But I think this starting idea came from Dufour, because he saw that it is possible in an academical situation to go beyond. So Romitelli was fed up with academic music. He was really, I remember, impatient with the Ivory Tower, the contemporary music festival. He dreamed of the different audience. That's really sure. He dreamed of being able to make music for rave party, but but actually he knew very well that his music would be heard by the same audience that listened to contemporary music. I think that is clear. it was a dream, but he was perfectly aware of the context where he did this operation, this renew of the language. The idea to see to this tradition, rock, techno, was really a way to go beyond the anemic contemporary music of the music festival. That it was really something that was very important for him. A new energy to find somewhere, new energy in relation to a tradition that for him was too formalist, too academic, and so on. And it was the reaction to a certain Boulesian model. It may be something typical of the 90 and the itinerary composer. It may be that you are more aware of these. You are perfectly right on this view, on the historical view of this period. I just have the experience of what I have seen from my friend in this period. So I was in Paris, and for me Romitelli was really an example, a friend, and I learned a lot from him. So what I can say.
Alessandro, when I hear you talking, I see very clearly that something is missing. A very precise and good and detailed biography before the background of music history of Romitelli. And I guess you have to write it. Who else?
One day.
Yeah, one day. If you
I don't know. It may be.
It is time, my dear friends, to close this session. I hope you don't mind that I took the word again. To every one of you who participated, and you, especially to you 12 speakers, thank you very much for a very intensive and very inspiring weekend with Fausto Romitelli's music that we spent together. Please don't forget the concert tonight. We'll have a first performance ever, which is quite a unique moment, and only with 20 people in our huge Konzertsaal, because there are no more allowed. One of those, it's me. That's wonderful. I will experience the world premiere of Romitelli live. Great. And now, for everybody who hopes that it's finally over, it is not. Because we will all come back, Sascha and I will come back to you, on you, because we plan to publish the proceedings of this. And we are looking very, very much forward to further and future contacts between Lübeck and all the other places. And we feel very pleased and very honored that you joined us here in Lübeck. Wish you a good time, stay safe. And with this, I end our little conference. Thank you very much.